Blood of Saint Bruno, The Curse of Mount Saint Bruno. Part 1, Whispers of the Mountain. Mount Saint Bruno was a serene and picturesque peak nestled in the heart of Quebec, just a short drive from Montreal. The mountain was a haven for those seeking peace, tranquility, and a break from the urban rush. Its lush trails were shaded by towering trees, and its peaks offered breathtaking views of the surrounding countryside. During the day, hikers and families would traverse the winding paths, their laughter mingling with the sound of birdsong and rustling leaves. But as the sun began to sink below the horizon, the mountain took on a different persona, a darker, more sinister one. The town at the base of the mountain, a quiet, affluent enclave where well-off families resided in sprawling, luxurious homes, harbored an unsettling secret. Visitors were welcome to enjoy the trails during daylight, but after sunset, the mountain was off-limits. Signs, placed discreetly but effectively, warned hikers to leave the mountain before dusk. The locals, ever polite and friendly, would gently remind any newcomers or tourists that the paths were closed in the evening for safety reasons. And while no one openly questioned the rule, there were whispers in the town, stories that seemed too strange to be true. Marie Tremblay, a Montreal native in her mid-30s, had recently moved to the town of Saint Bruno after landing a lucrative job. She had heard the legends surrounding the mountain but dismissed them as old wives' tales. The town itself was idyllic, too perfect, even. The streets were lined with pristine houses, each one more beautiful than the last, with well-manicured lawns and flower beds that seemed to bloom endlessly. At night, the lights from the grand homes would twinkle like stars against the dark backdrop of the mountain. Marie loved to hike, and Mount Saint Bruno's trails quickly became her favorite escape. She would walk for hours, breathing in the fresh air, reveling in the beauty of nature. Despite the locals' warnings, she found it hard to believe that the mountain could be dangerous. It was, after all, just a mountain. What harm could it possibly do? One evening, after a long day at work, Marie decided to take a late hike. The sun was already low in the sky when she reached the base of the mountain, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. She hesitated for a moment, recalling the warnings, but quickly shrugged them off. She wasn't superstitious, and besides, she had her phone and a flashlight. She would be fine. As she ascended the trail, the forest around her grew quieter, the sounds of birds and insects fading into an eerie stillness. The air, once fresh and cool, seemed to grow thick and oppressive, as though the mountain itself was aware of her presence. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she pushed it aside, quickening her pace. Halfway up the trail, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest was plunged into shadow. The tall trees loomed over her, their branches twisting together to form a dark canopy. Marie turned on her flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The mountain, which had seemed so inviting in the daylight, now felt cold and unwelcoming. A rustling sound echoed from somewhere off the trail, and Marie stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She scanned the forest with her flashlight but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, she muttered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. She continued walking, but the uneasy feeling persisted. It felt as though she were being watched, followed. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging her into complete darkness. She cursed under her breath and smacked the flashlight a few times, but it didn't come back on. Panic began to creep into her mind as the silence of the mountain pressed in around her. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Marie!" She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something unnatural about it, something that sent a surge of fear through her veins. "Marie!" The voice came again, closer this time. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. Her breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone, desperate to use its light to find her way back down the trail. Before she could turn it on, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, with pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. His clothes were old-fashioned, like some Marie's disappearance was the first in a string of tragedies that would soon plague the town of Saint Bruno. At first, the locals whispered about her carelessness, about how she had ignored the warnings and paid the price. But as the days turned into weeks, and more people vanished without a trace, the whispers grew louder. Fear spread through the community like wildfire, and soon, no one dared to approach the mountain after dark. But the warnings weren't enough for some. Curiosity, as it often does, got the better of a few brave, or foolish, souls. Maxime Dufresne was one of them. Maxime was a skeptic, a man who believed in science and logic over superstition and folklore. He had heard the stories about the mountain, about how the wealthy residents who lived in the grand houses on its slopes were never seen after sunset, about how they wandered the woods at night, searching for fresh blood. But he dismissed them as nothing more than legends, tales spun by the older generations to keep children from wandering too far into the forest. Maxime, like Marie, loved to hike. The mountain had been his sanctuary for years, a place where he could clear his mind and enjoy the beauty of nature. He refused to let fear ruin that for him. One evening, just before sunset, Maxime set off on his usual hike. He had heard about Marie's disappearance but brushed it off, confident that she had simply gotten lost in the woods. He wasn't worried. He knew the mountain better than anyone. As he ascended the trail, the sky began to darken, casting long shadows over the forest. The air grew cooler, and the familiar sounds of the mountain, birdsong, rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. Maxime's footsteps echoed loudly in the stillness, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the mountain was swallowed by darkness. Maxime switched on his flashlight, the narrow beam slicing through the night. A sudden movement in the trees caught his attention, and he stopped, shining his light toward the sound. For a moment, he saw nothing, just the dense underbrush and towering trees. But then, in the distance, something moved. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but Maxime caught a glimpse of it. A flash of pale skin and the glint of something metallic. "Hello," he called, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. There was no response. Maxime's heart began to race, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't the type to scare easily. It was probably just another hiker, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. He continued up the trail, but the sense of unease clung to him like a heavy fog. The forest, once so familiar, now felt foreign, hostile. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting together to form a dark, impenetrable canopy. Another rustling sound came from behind him, louder this time. Maxime spun around, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the trees. And then he saw them. 3 figures, standing just beyond the edge of the trail, their faces hidden in shadow. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the light from his flashlight. "Who's there?" Maxime demanded, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to stay calm. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They simply stood there, watching him. Maxime's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back.
Help.
Word of Maxime's disappearance spread quickly through the town, casting a pall over the once idyllic community. The mountain, once a place of beauty and peace, had become a place of fear and death. The locals whispered about the ancient curse that hung over Mount Saint Bruno, a curse that had plagued the mountain for centuries. It was said that the original settlers of the town, wealthy aristocrats fleeing persecution in Europe, had brought something dark with them, something ancient and hungry. They had built their grand homes on the slopes of the mountain, hiding their dark secret from the rest of the world. But over the years, the curse had seeped into the very soil of the mountain, infecting the land itself. And now, the people of the town lived in fear, knowing that the residents of the mountain, their neighbors, were not human. They were vampires. The town tried to cover it up, of course. They didn't want to scare away the tourists or tarnish the reputation of their affluent community. But the truth was impossible to hide. People were dying. Natalie Bergeron, a young woman who had recently moved to the town with her fiancé, was the next to fall victim. She had heard the warnings, of course. She had been told not to go near the mountain after sunset. But Natalie wasn't one to be easily frightened. She had grown up in a big city, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of modern life. She didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. To her, The stories about the mountain were just that, stories. One evening, she decided to take a walk up the mountain trail, eager to clear her head after a long day of wedding planning. The sun was setting, but she wasn't worried. She would be back before dark, she told herself. As she walked along the trail, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Natalie stopped to take in the view, unaware of the eyes watching her from the shadows. The attack came without warning. A figure leaped out from the trees, tackling her. The town of Saint Bruno was on edge. The disappearances were piling up, but the local authorities seemed reluctant to do anything about it. The police, who were usually quick to respond, now seemed hesitant, as though they were afraid to investigate too deeply. Rumors swirled among the residents. Some whispered that the police were in on it, that they were being paid off by the wealthy families who lived on the mountain. Others believed that the vampires had some kind of hold over the town, controlling it from behind the scenes. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear: the town was cursed. The people of Saint Bruno had tried to cover up the horrors of the mountain for too long, and now the curse was spreading. More people vanished every week. Those who dared to walk the mountain after dark were never seen again. The town was suffocating under the weight of fear, its once thriving streets now empty and silent after sunset. And the vampires, those ancient, bloodthirsty creatures, continued to roam the mountain, their hunger insatiable. It was a quiet evening when Luke, a young man who had grown up in Saint Bruno, decided to confront the truth. He had lost his sister to the mountain just a few weeks earlier. She had gone hiking, despite the warnings, and never returned. The authorities had dismissed it as an accident, just another hiker who had gotten lost in the woods. But Luke knew better. He had seen the way the people of the town whispered about the mountain, the way they avoided it after dark. They knew. That night, Luke armed himself with a flashlight and a knife. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was determined to uncover the truth about the mountain. As he ascended the trail, the air grew colder, and the forest around him seemed to close in. The familiar sounds of the woods were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The trees, once so welcoming, now loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled. The sun set, casting the mountain in darkness. Luke continued up the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. But he didn't stop. He reached the clearing where his sister had last been seen, the ground littered with fallen leaves and broken branches. His flashlight flickered, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Something moved in the trees. Luke's grip tightened on the knife as he scanned the darkness. He could feel it, the presence of something unnatural, something ancient. And then he saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, stepping out from the shadows. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light, their lips curled into cruel smiles. The vampires. Luke backed away, his heart racing, but it was too late. They moved too quickly, surrounding him in an instant. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them whispered, their voice soft and cold. "This is our mountain." Luke raised the knife, but the vampires only laughed. One of them, a woman with long, dark hair and eyes that glowed like embers, stepped forward, her smile widening. "We don't like intruders," she whispered, and then they descended on him. Luke's scream echoed through the forest, but no one came to help. The town of Saint Bruno had learned to live with the curse of the mountain. The wealthy residents who lived in the grand houses on its slopes continued to hide their dark secret, and the townspeople, terrified and powerless, kept quiet. The disappearances continued, but the authorities did nothing. The town was trapped in a cycle of fear and silence, unwilling or unable to break free from the grip of the vampires. Every evening, as the sun set, the mountain would fall silent and the vampires would roam, searching for fresh blood. And every morning, the town would wake to find another person missing, another life claimed by the darkness. But nothing changed. The people of Saint Bruno had learned to keep their heads down, to stay indoors after sunset, and to pretend that the horrors of the mountain didn't exist. But the vampires were always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next foolish soul to wander too